We are in 1 Timothy chapter 6 this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 6. And where we left off last week was talking about these different groups within the church. And really one of the main ideas that Paul seems to be getting across is that, first of all of these groups have value. Much of what Paul has to say about the different types of groups, and just kind of by way of reminder, those groups that we've covered so far are all Christians of various ages. And David did a good job last week talking about kind of bridging the age gap within the church. So that was an excellent supplement to what we talked about last week. So all Christians of different age groups. Group number 2 is widows, specifically the support of widows, but Paul has quite a bit to say there about that. And then he goes back to another discussion of elders. We cover the characteristics of elders in chapter 3, and then he talks about the respect due to elders in chapter 5. And part of that respect that's due to them is also the responsibility that comes along with that. And then this morning, the fourth group that we were going to talk about is that of slaves and masters. Servants and masters, or slaves and masters, depending on how that's rendered. Now, one other thing about this series of groups, yes, all of these groups have value, and as such, they should be awarded the rights. Rights is maybe not the best word, but the good things that come along with having value. Much of what he has to say in chapter 5 is about showing respect for each of these groups. In that first group, the different age groups, don't rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers. And so there's this familial respect and connection that is due to Christians of all types within the church. Of course, when he talks about widows, he does talk about the respect that is due to them, but there's also responsibility on the part of the widows as well. The type of lives that they should have led up to the point of needing to be supported. We talked about that. And then, of course, the elders. They are due that double honor, as the text says, but also they have a very great responsibility. And so when an elder errs or an elder strays or deliberately does something that's wrong, then that has to be dealt with swiftly, and it has to be dealt with publicly. And he's very clear on that. So this morning, we're going to talk about this fourth group, and we'll wrap up this section. So chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. He says, all who are under the yoke as slaves must regard their own masters to be worthy of all respect, so that God's name and his teaching will not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters should not be disrespectful to them because they are brothers, but should serve them better, since those who benefit from their service are believers and dearly loved. Okay, so we have this term slaves or servants, and that can take all kinds of forms. It really could, in our English vernacular, take both of those forms. We would assign different meanings to both of those. Yes, both are in a serving capacity, but when we use the word slave, we tend to think of it as more of a forced servitude, an involuntary servitude. So there are multiple reasons why someone could be a slave or a bonded servant in this time period. First of all, it could be someone who is captured in war. Rome is obviously an empire that is spreading and continues to take over different lands. And so the peoples of those lands could be forced into servitude based on their part in that conflict. Those that are sold into slavery, there are those that we kind of think of typically more along the main lines of what we think of, that those who are captured and find themselves in bondage, and then they are sold on some sort of market. The third one, those who are born into slavery. There could be those who were in families where the parents were in bondage or slavery, and now they have been born and they are in that same caste system. And then, of course, number four, those who are paying some sort of restitution for a crime. They need to either pay back what they owe, and then their time of servitude will be over, or this could be a punitive thing. They could be punished because they are failing to pay back. So what I want to be, what we have to wrestle with, not only in 1 Timothy, but in various places where Paul talks about servants and about the relationship between servants and masters, and just the situation of being a slave in and of itself. So one of the things that often gets used as a knock against the scriptures and against Paul specifically is that nowhere does he say in this letter, slavery bad. He doesn't, and that's one of the things that constantly gets put on Paul is he thinks that slavery is okay. Well, for one thing, again, we've just dealt with a couple of different situations, and there could be more than that. Those are just kind of the four main ones that I could think of. But what we're dealing with is a time and a place in history. This is the setting that Paul lives in, and he is dealing with that setting. Paul's purpose here in this letter is not to deal with the rightness or wrongness of slavery or bondage. His purpose is to deal with if you find yourself in that situation and you are a follower of Christ, what should your attitude be? That's what we're dealing with. Now, I will say, I just said that Paul never talks about slavery or the rightness of wrongness. He actually does mention one thing that would key us in to believe that he is against forced servitude, as in capturing someone and forcing them into bondage, something that we would more typically think of as slavery. For instance, the African slave hunts and people being brought from there to here and forced into that. And it's actually in the first chapter of this letter, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. Remember, he's talking about the law at that point and how the law points out unrighteousness and sin. That's really one of its main purposes. And so in chapter 9, he says, we know the law is not meant for a righteous person, but for the lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinful, for the unholy and irreverent, for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, the homosexuals, for kidnappers, liars, perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching based on the glorious gospel of the blessed God that was entrusted to me. Did you see a word in there that would negate slave hunts? Kidnappers. The literal word there is man-stealers. Sure. Okay, so to that end, Brett quoted an Old Testament passage from Exodus chapter 21 that does actually deal with this same topic. And actually, if you look at this whole list here in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he is dealing with topics that came directly from the law of Moses itself. And so Paul's pointing out the true purpose of the law. But that one term, and again, based on the Exodus 21 passage, is Paul does not condone kidnapping. And again, that's kind of where our minds typically go to in terms of slavery. So to say that Paul is pro-slavery or pro stealing of people and forcing them into some sort of bondage, that's not his position. It doesn't seem to be based on what he has to say here. So I just want to make that point. Now, let's deal with the topic at hand then. So again, if you find yourself in that situation, those who are under the yoke as slaves, how does he say that they should regard their masters? He says they should be worthy of all respect. Now, let me ask this question. Does Paul qualify in this verse, not the next verse, in this verse, does he qualify this statement with how the master is treating the servant or the slave? Is there anything here to say only if your master is good should you show them respect? No, there's not. So this is a blanket statement that Paul is making. Their masters should regard their own masters to be worthy of all respect, so that God's name and his teaching will not be blasphemed. Now, when we read in Philippians chapter 2 about how Jesus came to live among us, how is Jesus described there? He gave up divinity for a time, and he did what? He took on the form of a bondservant. That's right, or of a slave, or of a servant. Okay, so Jesus took on a form of service, of slavery, in order that a greater good might be accomplished. And he lived his whole life according to that philosophy. Okay, so, or according to that part of God's plan. So Paul's saying, even your Lord and Master Jesus, who you claim to follow, was in a position of slavery or service. Okay, so he lived that way, so you should live that way, so his teaching will not be blasphemed. Now, verse 2, he does also say, those who have believing masters should not be disrespectful to them because they are brothers, but should serve them better, since those who benefit from their service are believers and dearly loved. So we talked about double honor being given to elders, but here he doesn't use the phrase double honor, but he does say, if you have a believing master, so you are a servant in that household, or you're a bondservant, or someone who's in servitude because of a debt or something like that, you should show a believing master double respect, because they're brothers, they're family, to use the relationship that Paul has already talked about. And so if the master's a believer, you should work just as hard because he cares for you. Are there situations today in which we can apply things from this teaching to ourselves? I'm looking around this audience. I don't believe anyone in here in this room at the time is a slave or servant of some sort. So can we apply this somehow? Ted, you had your hand raised.
I've always assumed that it says that it was that they were not or not. And I'll tell you, specifically, we're supposed to obey the laws of the land, respect our leaders. Not always, though. Up until the point where worshiping God will be illegal.
Yes.
And it doesn't need to say that, it says respect, but it is inferred that you're still able to do certain things.
Yes.
And again, slavery at this time was completely different. We're just thinking of the worst situation.
Right. Right.
But I've always heard that much more conservative relationship with class system could not. It's not like they could be free and then go get a job.
Right.
Completely different from what we in America think of. Oh man, abuse slaves.
Right.
Yep. I think it's safe to infer that obey and be great and do everything you can, honor and respect, show the faith, is that it's not an abusive situation. Just like I will obey the laws of the land as long as it makes it illegal to worship God, and I will break the laws of worship.
Yep. You have a Daniel right there, right? You have other characters within the Bible story that do that very thing. Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. But should someone in China today, if the police come to their door and they, say you're under arrest because you're worshiping and doing those things, should they fight? I think in regard to kind of what Paul's saying here and other places that even Jesus talks about, that our position is not to be in what's the word I'm looking for? We're not looking to pick a fight, right? And we're not looking to physically fight back. We will continue to peacefully worship as we're called to, however we can, but we're to look different. Eddie, you have something.
When you look at Paul's first trial before the Sanhedrin, there was an occasion where the chief priest said something to Paul, and Paul responded back to criticize him for his lack of understanding of the law. And then somebody told Paul and said, "Do you speak to the chief priest that way?" And Paul's response was, "I was not aware that he was the chief priest." And then he quoted, he said, "You shall not speak evil of the priest." And so here's an example where someone was outside of the law, or Paul for being outside of the law, but also showed respect for his position. And I think even though this isn't a slave relationship that Paul was involved in, I think it's the principle that he's using right here to say, show respect to someone who lawfully has authority over you and you're here for a master.
Yeah.
Regardless of how well they do their job.
Right. Just the way that Jesus did. And he's going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Brett.
Just good. John 18:36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is of this world. Thus servants who fight that might not be delivered over to the Jews. My kingdom is not from this world."
Okay, so Brett's referencing John chapter 18, verse, you said 36? Yes, we are going to come back to that passage in just a minute because it has relevance to what we're talking about later on in this chapter. So hold that thought. Mike.
I think looking for an application for us, not like it's struck me, is, there are other similar situations we might find ourselves in where maybe it's the government or maybe it's someone else who's oppressing us. This kind of gets into this whole broader thing of turning the other cheek, going the extra mile, blessed is the meek. All that I think ties into this. This is a particularly difficult example, and I think we recognize that. So I think part of the application is when we're in those situations where maybe we think we need to be fighting back, this is the inspiration saying, it can get a lot worse than this. You can be a lot more oppressed than you are right now.
Right.
That one applies to you would still be, it is not your place to try to fix the injustices of the world. It's your place to be the best Christian.
Yes, yes. And again, I just want to underline that fact. Paul is giving guidance to people in the situations that they are in. Okay, now, as Mike said, this is a different time and a place, but this could be our time and place at some point in the future. But we don't know. We don't know what tomorrow holds. But what is our attitude going to be when and if that time comes? And that, I think, is what this deals with. Now, as Ted mentioned, we probably are dealing with more of a household servant type relationship here. But when he uses the word slave or doulos is the word, it is used of both things. It is used of servants and used of slaves and bond servants and all. It's all encapsulated in that word. So, but I do think that the sentiment holds true. And I didn't mean to spend this much time on it, but it's a good discussion. Our attitude should be the same. And that's the point that Paul makes in Philippians chapter 2. He says, make your attitude like that of Christ. And we know that in all situations, yes, he got upset. Yes, he rebuked where it was necessary. But Jesus was respectful in all situations to the situation he was in. Okay? So this is a great discussion. We do need to move on, but that's excellent discussion. And we've got to work through those things because, again, people are going to knock the scriptures based on things like that, where it said, well, you're condoning slavery or saying it's okay, or no. That's, first of all, that's not what's being dealt with here. And secondly, there's larger principles in play. Okay, so let's continue on here to verse 3. All right, so he says, Teach and encourage these things. And I think these things encompasses all of what he just got done saying, not just the, section on slaves and masters. Teach and encourage these things. If anyone teaches other doctrine and does not agree with the sound teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ and with the teaching that promotes godliness, he is conceited, understanding nothing, but having a sick interest in disputes and arguments over words. From these come envy, quarreling, slanders, evil suspicions, and constant disagreement among men whose minds are depraved and deprived of the truth, who imagine that godliness is a way to material gain. So let's pause right there for just 1 second. So Paul says then that the type of teaching that Timothy is to help combat is done for selfish reasons. And we already saw that in chapter 1. Those men that want to be teachers of the law because presumably they want the prestige that comes along with that title or that having the regard of men to say, oh, he's so smart. He's the one we need to go to for answers. Timothy is to combat that type of teaching, that done for selfish reasons, those that seek notoriety and influence, and ultimately, a section that he's going to deal with right here, those that are doing it for financial gain, for profit. So, we see one of the end goals here. It's not just notoriety, it's all the privileges that come with that, all the perks. You know, kind of like we kind of talk about politicians that way, right? These days that, yeah, they got a lot of responsibility, but hey, they got all the perks that go with it, or CEOs or whatever. But rather than promoting the gospel and bringing people together in a common purpose of service to God and to one another. And remember, that's what he said was the goal of our instruction in verse 5 of chapter 1. The goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And he'll talk about people that deviated with that. So rather than promoting the gospel and bringing people together in a common purpose of service to God and one another, the false teacher creates division and factions by focusing on topics that promote argument and strife. Now, in chapter 1, it seemed like his focus was more on the Jewish component, those that wanted to be teachers of the law, but they were teaching things that they didn't understand. They were teaching things that they shouldn't have been doing. And it seemed like they were trying to hold people to the law, similar to the Galatian letter and other places. But all these things are doing is promoting divisions and factions and arguments and strife and just purposeless discussions. He says, you need to stick with the main thing. Teach and encourage these things, Timothy, the respect for one another that mirrors the respect that Christ had. And so in creating this kind of us versus them scenario, the false teacher can promote himself as more righteous and pious, all for profit. And so if you have the King James Version or the New King James or some others, there's a phrase that's added in here that may not be in some, for instance, it's not in mine, where after he says, those who imagine that godliness is a way to material gain, he says, from such, withdraw yourself. You need to create a clear distinction between yourself and these types of people. You need to get away from that because it's poisoning the assembly, poisoning the church. You don't want to get wrapped up into that. We've seen the divisions that causes in 1 Corinthians. We've seen that in various other churches where the focus is on self and me rather than the doctrine that Christ preaches. And so he goes on then in verse 6. But, now the contrast here, but godliness with contentment is a great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing out. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. But those who want to be rich fall into temptation, a trap, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Now, again, think about the setting that Timothy is in at the time that this letter is written. Timothy's in Ephesus. We've already mentioned Ephesus is an affluent city. They're a port city where lots of money and ideas are coming through. There probably is a very clear distinction between those who have lots of money and those who don't. He dealt with a situation like that in the church. The women were coming in with braided hair and kind of pointing the focus back on themselves. But so there's this contrast here, and it's kind of actually a play on words. In verse 5, he says, those who imagine that godliness is a way to great material gain. But he says, verse 6, but godliness with contentment is a great gain. Be content with what you have. And again, we could think back to the Philippian letter and Paul talking about contentment there and about, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound, and none of that matters. I know contentment because I know Jesus Christ. And so he plays on this words of his previous statement. Evil men twist the gospel and show false piety as a means of profit. Look at me, listen to me, and then I will reap the benefits of that. Even though I'm looking pious, I'm looking like I don't care about any of those things, but I know that you'll take care of me. Okay, so however, piety practiced without selfish motivation is very profitable, Paul says. And so you've almost got this kind of absurd dichotomy there. Those who don't seek material gain have something greater. Think back to Matthew chapter 5 and the Beatitudes at the beginning in the Sermon on the Mount. How many of those situations that Jesus mentions there lend themselves to prosperity, to good living, to living the high life? None of them. People who are persecuted, people who are mourning and suffering and hunger and all of those types of things. Yet, Jesus says that there is great profit in those, not in and of themselves, but in living in that situation because you are blessed. You are blessed by God. And blessing there does not mean that God is a vending machine and he's going to give you all the material things that you want. The blessing there is having God's approval, having God's good esteem. And when we are in that position, that's what ultimately matters. So no matter what situation you find yourself in, godliness with contentment is a great gain. Viewing ourselves as mere stewards of our earthly possessions, without a desire for more and more, is the way that we will truly gain the most satisfaction in this life. And Paul describes that greed in much the same way the Proverbs writer does, right? In Proverbs chapter 1, he talks about those that are persecuting people for financial gain. And he says, come, let us be harmful let it cause harm to these people so that we may profit. And he says that the proverb writer says that is a pit and a snare. And that's the same thing that Paul says here. Those who want to be rich fall into temptation, a trap, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge people into ruin and destruction. It is nice to have money. I mean, that we can all agree on that. It's nice to have money. It's nice to be able to afford all the things that we want, and in many situations, and then some. It's nice. And Paul is not calling that sinful. We need to be clear about that here as well. What he is calling sinful is this constant attitude that's just only focuses on the money and only focuses on gaining more money. That's what Paul is dealing with. And so what we do with that money, what we do with those resources, that is the key. Because, verse 7, we brought nothing into this world and we can't take anything out. Ultimately, it's not going to matter. But what we did with what God gave us, or what came across our path, that's what matters. In the constant pursuit of wealth, men believe that all their woes will be solved with just a little more. Ultimately, though, what Paul says is pursuit of wealth is going to accomplish two things. First of all, fruitless wandering. If we're constantly worried about getting more money, we're straying from our original purpose. We're not doing what we're supposed to do. And senseless self-destruction, because ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's just going to be destroyed in the end. Okay? So before we move on to the last part of the chapter, last comments.
I appreciate how Paul emphasizes godliness with content.
Yes.
The other one is as a pursuit of himself, have no problem. Certainly the idea of pursuing the wealth of this world has no real problem. But even the idea of looking at godliness almost as a burden. The attitude that some Christians have that, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do anything I really like to do, but I'm doing this to please God. And so I've got heaven looking for, to look forward to at the end.
Yep.
But they're miserable.
Yep.
They're not content.
Right.
And Paul's saying there's no profit in that life.
Yep.
And then those who, all they want to do is just be happy.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to be happy. I don't care. I just want to be happy. There's no profit in that.
Right.
But when you are seeking to do things in God's way and being content in doing that, that's where the great profit is.
Yes. Yes. And they will result from one another. The more content we are with that, the more we come to that realization, the more we can say, I don't have need of anything else. There are far more important things in life for me to be concerned with than this. So why should I waste my time on it? Why should I be consumed with it? Because ultimately it's just making me unhappy. Okay. Any other thoughts? Miss?
I thought it's just really to me about this past week. And it makes me wonder if Paul didn't really start out and have these ideas. It's just completely my thought on this in prison. And what his experiences in prison actually led him to actually start looking, once he got outside of prison, to start looking at the world and go, oh my, this looks exactly like prison. Because we know that today in our country, that those incarcerated in certain places are going through exactly that, and they're not getting food and clothing that they're needing. And so it just makes my mind go to the point to where if we get to that point as Christians that we become incarcerated like Paul just for our Christianity, are we going to be able to withstand everything that we do? It just makes you think as a Christian, is my faith strong?
A question we should constantly be asking, right? Is my faith strong enough? That contentment comes from a trust, ultimately a trust, and trust lends itself to faith, really. And again, if we go back to that statement in 1 Timothy chapter 1, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. If we're trusting in anything else, then how can that faith be sincere? Because when that thing that that part of our trust in goes away, will the other part of our trust go away as well? So it's very possible that Paul could have gained a new appreciation for it as he was in prison. He may have even thought back on his time as one who put people in prison and the situations that he put them in. And that might have also given him a new respect as well. But certainly Paul went through his number of times of prosperity and times of just rock bottom, for sure. So he does have his bona fides, if we're going to say that. Very good. Okay, well, let's continue on to the last part of the chapter so we can finish up by the end of class here. Verse 11, now you, man of God, run from these things, but pursue righteousness and godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight for the faith. Take hold of eternal life to which you were called and have made a good confession before many witnesses. In the presence of God, who gives life to all, and before Christ Jesus, who gave a good confession before Pontius Pilate, I charge you to keep the commandment without spot or blame until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which God will bring about in his own time. He is the blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and the only one who has immortality, dwelling in unapproachable light, whom none of mankind has seen or can see, to whom be honor and eternal might. Amen. Okay, so in all things, kind of as we've been saying, all situations, the godly person doesn't seek to divide or destroy, but rather to unite and to build up. And Paul mentions some specific ways of doing that: pursuing righteousness and godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. And think about how many of those things that Paul mentions there are the same types of characteristics that we see in elders and deacons and all of those that Paul says we're to have some esteem for. Righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. And so Paul urges Timothy, while encouraging these things, while preaching about these things, to be bold in that work, proclaiming the same pure message that Jesus confessed while standing before Pilate. So let's get to that statement in just one second. But my translation used the term there, verse 12, fight the good fight for the faith. Now, back to our discussion just a minute ago. What does Paul mean by that for Timothy? What does it mean, fight the good fight? Is he encouraging violence? What is Paul saying there?
Speaking more to the spiritual fight that we face every day, which is, people say, you know, there's a phrase that the devil didn't do it. Well, the devil didn't really make do it, but our adversary does tempt and sort of nudge us in a way. And really, it's a fight against ourselves.
Right.
There's a song I listen to that says, "You can't stop me. The only one that can't stop me is me." You know, if I get into my own temptations, that's on me.
Right.
You know, it's not really on my adversary who tempted me that way, and he laughs that I failed. But it's really on me.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy's fight is to go in and I mean, he's in Ephesus. He's having to help encourage this people, like in this culture where they're surrounded by idol worship and they're surrounded by this port city that has so many different temptations, so many different people traveling in and out, everything. I mean, you really talk really well about it. But there's lots of stuff that's going to draw people away. And Paul is telling Timothy, you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Keep striving.
Okay. All right. So think back to the Ephesian letter, the letter that was written to this church merely a year or two before this letter. Paul rounds out the letter in Ephesians chapter 6 by talking about warfare. And how does he do that? What's the context in which Paul does that? Ephesians 6. What does he use as an image? A soldier, right? Armor, putting on armor. And yet that armor is not physical armor. Paul is not telling the Ephesian brethren, go to your house and get your armor on and start walking around among men. All of that armor is spiritual in nature. And so Paul says there is a battle going on here in the book of Ephesians, but that battle is not an earthly battle. It is a battle against the powers and principalities and all of those things. So, and if we are talking about a physical battle, how would that jive with the aspects I just mentioned, love and gentleness and those types of things? No, the fight that he mentions is again, as Nate mentioned, that kind of constancy, that steadfastness in holding to the truth, both the personal battles that we inwardly deal with and the struggles that we will outwardly deal with, and how to do those as well. So he mentions then before Christ Jesus, in the presence of God, who gives life to all, and before Christ Jesus, who gave a good confession before Pontius Pilate. Now, I think Paul doesn't include things in letters without a reason. Like, this is not just a throwaway statement. What was Jesus' attitude while he was sitting in front of Pilate? How did he maintain himself? How did he compose himself, carry himself? Humility, gentleness. Did he say much? No. He was patient. All of those types of things. And yet, when he did finally say something to Pilate, every part of it had purpose. And every part of it was done with respect. It was done appropriate to the situation that he was in at the time, but it was done with purpose and meaning. Jesus was fighting a battle right there, standing in the spotlight in front of Pilate. And if you think about the passage that Brett mentioned just a second ago, John chapter 18, and I actually have verse 37 there. So Brett mentioned verse 36. So he says, John 18, standing before Pilate, Pilate has just accused him and said, your own nation and chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? And so Jesus says there in verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom does not have its origin here. So Jesus is preaching here. Even just in this 2-sentence statement, Jesus is preaching. And so Pilate asked the question then, verse 37, wait, are you saying you're a king? Is that what's going on here? You say that I'm a king. Jesus replied, I was born for this. And I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. That is the attitude that Jesus had standing before Pilate. And so now Paul references that instance right here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, talk about how when we stand in a place of conflict or persecution or difficulty, we do the same thing. Eddie.
And Adam, I agree with all those things that Jesus was humble. He was relatively quiet. Well, I think he said more to Pilate than he did anybody else that he spoke to during his time.
Right.
But Jesus also stood there as the victor.
Yes.
He knew before the conversation started that he was the victor. He, at one point, told Pilate that the only authority you have is that which was given to you. As you pointed out, he stood there as the king, he acknowledged he was the king. And that, I think, is a great lesson for us. We're not the king.
Right.
But when we are fighting that fight against evil, we need to recognize that we are on the victorious side.
Yes.
Even before the battle has started, we know that our side is going to win, has won.
Right, right. And that's Jesus' point to Peter in the garden, right? Like those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. That's not what this kingdom is. This kingdom is something greater. And so the fight for it is going to be something greater as well. Okay, so we look at the rest of the chapter here. I don't know if that was the end of my slides. I guess it is. Yeah. Okay. So Paul gives final instructions here, verse 17. Instruct those who are rich in the present age not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the age to come, so that they may take hold of life that is real. Now, a lot of things that Paul has to say here, not just in terms of talking to that group, the rich, but in what he has to say to them, mirror statements that he made in the book of Titus, which we talked about on Wednesday night. And for instance, the main statement that comes to my mind is, instruct them to do good and to be rich in good works. And that is a theme in the book of Titus, is good works. Learn how to do them. Learn how to be content with them, and learn how to build others up with good works. And so again, he's not saying that being wealthy is a sinful thing here. That is not his point. His point is where is your focus with that wealth? What are you ultimately putting that trust in? And what are you doing with the resources that God has given to you? So the last thing that he says to Timothy, then verse 20, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, avoiding irreverent, empty speech and contradictions from the knowledge that falsely bears that name. By professing it, some people have deviated from the faith. Grace be with all of you. Timothy, hold firm in this. So those are really kind of the two main takeaways from the book of Timothy. In all these instructions that Paul has given and all of this doctrine that Paul has emphasized, remain firm in it. Don't deviate from it. To the right, to the left, a little or a lot. Don't deviate from it, because this is life. Anything else will lead you astray and cause you pain. Okay, with that, we're going to end 1 Timothy this morning, and then Mike will pick up with 2 Timothy next week. Thank you for all your discussion this morning.